Today's topic is absolute value. This particular video is probably going to be a little longer than some of what I hope they're going to be, and that's mostly because this is kind of a lot of review of sixth grade stuff that you should know. It's also important to information that we're going to learn in seventh grade, but everyone's going to sort of be at different places, so there's going to be a review, but some of it won't apply to you depending on how much you remember from sixth grade. But it's some stuff that I've noticed that seventh graders have had trouble with in the past, so I know that we need to sort of go over it just briefly before we move on with what's important for seventh grade involving absolute value. Before we can do anything with absolute value, a couple things we need to know. First, absolute value involves a number line. So here's a number line. Just notice a couple of things here. We have 0 in the middle. That's often going to be what we're going to do this year. That doesn't have to be the case, though. Just depends. You could have 0 here with 1, then the negatives. We'll look at different situations. For now, 0 is directly in the middle. You have your positives to the right of 0, negatives to the left of 0. And it's exact opposites. So positive one's here, negative one's there, and so on. If we want to plot a point, here's the biggest mistake I see students making at your age, is a lot of times they'll go, like, let's say we want to plot -3. They'll go above it somewhere and put a dot. And that is not ever the right way to do it. So if you want to plot a number on a number line, what you're going to do is go on the line to the number you're plotting. So let's say I want to put -3. That would be -3 right on the line at the intersection of the number line itself and this little mark here. So this would be -3 on the number line. I could do the same thing for any other number. That would be 2, and so on. Another concept that is vitally important before we get into absolute value is when do we use positive numbers versus when do we use negative numbers. You probably already know this, but just in case, let's briefly review. Positive numbers are great when we're talking about going forward. Like if a car goes forward this much, or if the quarterback throws the ball forward and past the line of scrimmage, that would all be positive numbers. So if the quarterback threw the ball for 15 yards, that would be a positive 15. We also use positive numbers when we're talking about going up. Like if you have a hot air balloon that goes up 20 feet, you would use a positive 20. We also use it if you're gaining something. You go back to the quarterback and gaining yards instead of saying forward. You could also talk about gaining money. Someone gives you something. Anytime you're getting something, you're usually going to use a positive number. And the last one that we're going to talk about is depositing, because sometimes you'll see that someone's depositing money into their bank account. That's positive. If I deposit $10, that means my account's going up $10, which is a positive gain. There are lots of situations where you use positives. Those are just some of the ways, or some of the reasons. Negatives are sort of the opposite. So instead of going forward, if you're talking about going backwards, that's a negative. If a car goes backwards, or so on. Usually if you talk about going down, you're going to express that in terms of negative numbers. So a submarine under the sea level, they're down under the sea level, the submarine would be at a negative distance. Or if you're losing, that would be a negative number. Or if you spend money, instead of deposit, you're writing checks, you're spending money, that would be a negative. Or if you go into debt, if I have $5 in my account, but I spend $10 with my debit card, that means I'm at -5. I'm $5 in debt. So there are times when we care about what sign is there. Should be something you got in sixth grade. That's the reason we're going so fast through it. There are also times when we really don't care at all. So if we look at this next slide, there are times in life when negative, positive, it doesn't matter. Generally, it's when we're talking about distance. If you look at this example here, and I'm going to read, ignore the rest of it, because I'm just trying to illustrate one point. So right here, and here's the information. So just looking at that, suppose you go 3 blocks east, 6 blocks west, 11 blocks east again. Now you could talk in terms of positive or negative. Maybe 3 blocks east is +3, then the west would be -6. You could do that. But if the question is, right here, how far did you go, well, it really doesn't matter which direction, because it's just about how far did you walk. Well, I walked 3 blocks east, 6 blocks west. That's where they got the 3 here and the 6 from. And then 11 blocks east again. Doesn't matter which direction, it just says how far did I go? Well, I went 6 plus 3 plus 11, 20 blocks. So it doesn't matter. That is a time when we use what we call absolute value. When we don't care so much about which direction we're going, all we care about is how far, distance. And we'll just ignore that, so keep it a little shorter. So here's what absolute value means. The real world application we just talked about is a little more confusion than the actual meaning. Once we get into it, it'll seem easier than it probably just did. All it means is how far is a number from 0. So if you look here at 6 on a number line, and I'll go ahead and just plot it the proper way, 6. Well, how far is it from 0? Well, it's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. It's 6 spaces from 0. So the absolute value of 6, and we would write it like this, you'll see that on the next slide, put 2 bars, is 6, because 6 is 6 spaces from 0. And we're talking about distance, it's never going to be negative, so let's look here. Absolute value of negative 6 is right here. Well, let's count. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. How many spaces is negative 6 from 0? Well, it's also 6. Also positive. Let's look at the next slide so you can sort of see a little more about that. The absolute value of negative 9 would be written with 2 bars is 9. The absolute value of 3 is 3. The absolute value of 0 is 0. The absolute value of negative 156 is 156. So hopefully you picked up on the pattern that it is always positive. Absolute value is always positive. We'll look at some different situations that don't contradict that but may seem to at first. But basically, if we're talking about how far something is, distance, it can't ever be negative. It doesn't. If you jump in your car and you drive 25 miles, it wouldn't matter if you drove 25 miles with your car forwards or drove it in reverse 25 miles. In the end, how many miles did you put on your car? 25. Absolute value is for distance because distance is always positive. You can never go out and measure a building and see that the building is negative 10 feet high. It would be 10 feet. Always positive. And that's when we use absolute value. So the easy way to remember absolute value is that it is never negative. It's always, always positive. So we look at a lot of situations that are negative, but if it ever says absolute value or you can tell it should be absolute value, you know it's always positive. So basically what absolute value means is you take away any negative sign that's in front of the number and put it all as positive. And then here's the absolute value symbol. You just use this little mark here. I'll highlight it. That line there on both sides, and it's straight up and down, versus some people get it confused with the parentheses like that. It's not like that. It's straight up and down. That means absolute value. So the absolute value of negative 5 is 5. Absolute value of 7 is 7. So most of the time it's pretty simple. Absolute value of 5 is, well, if I counted on a number line, 5 would be 5 spaces from 0, so it would be 5. There's the absolute value, negative 5. Also 5 spaces. Here's the only time that it's sort of different. Not really different, but it seems like it at first. If you have the absolute value of negative 2, well, how many spaces is negative 2 from 0? 2 spaces, so that would be 2. The only thing that would be a little bit different is if there's ever a negative out in front. The way that you would read that is what is the opposite, that's what this means, of the absolute value negative 2. Well, the absolute value of negative 2 is positive 2. The opposite of positive 2 is negative 2. an easy way to remember that, because we're going to talk a lot more about opposites, and hopefully you'll start getting that later. An easy way to remember that is if there's ever a negative on the outside of these bars, you actually have to keep it. It's on the outside. You do this part first, the absolute value of negative 2 is 2, then you keep that negative and keep it at a negative 2. Try another one just like that. Absolute value of 5. Only we're going to do the opposite of that. Well, the first thing we would do, well, what's the absolute value of 5? That's easy. 5 is 5 spaces from 0, so it's 5. But if you notice, there's a negative sign outside, which means we have to keep that negative sign, and it's the opposite of that, which is a negative 5, and that would be the answer. Okay, so let's do one other thing just briefly. Sometimes you'll have more than one number, and we're going to do a lot more of these when we get into integers, but just make sure you see it once now. This actually isn't that bad at all. If you understand absolute value, it's pretty easy. All you do is say, what's 8 minus 2? You get 6, and then you do that absolute value part later. Absolute value of 6 is 6. And then in that same sort of problem, sometimes you'll have this. Negative absolute value of negative 3 plus absolute value of 6 plus 2. Well, all you do in this case is go ahead and anything in the absolute value, go ahead and add it. It's kind of what you would think to do anyways for most people. 6 plus 2 is 8. So I'm going to just copy everything else down. Sorry, it's difficult to write with this mouse. Now, we can't add these two absolute values without knowing what they are. So the next step is to find out what are these. Well, the absolute value of negative 3 is positive 3. Absolute value of 8 is 8. And then it's as easy as 8 plus 3 is 11. And then we're done. So hopefully you completed the note sheet that I'm going to give you, or that I gave you today, and written down any questions that you have. I'm sure there's some things you're probably confused about. We will talk about these tomorrow. Let me know what questions you have, and we'll go over whatever we need to.